Polina Ivanov was sold as property, payment for a debt. The entire family watched the wedding as if it were a corporate merger that might turn into a romance in time. They said, "What a joke." She knew the truth everyone pretended to ignore. Her father had embezzled millions, sold information, broken the sacred code, and the price wasn't his death, it was her. Because the one thing that truly destroys a father, watching his daughter pay for his crimes. Now she was in the bridal chamber, black lace pajamas, waiting, prepared to endure, comply, and survive. When Arseny Lenski, the mob boss, walked in, she was shocked by his first words. "I only touch what chooses me. Your punishment, getting nothing from me." Hey viewer, I'm Lena, the writer of all these stories here on the channel, and today I came to thank Rude and Athena. Thanks for the comments, everyone. All your comments are welcome, including criticism, so I can improve. So if you want to appear in the next video, answer me below. Do you think a woman married against her will because of her father can fall in love with the husband she didn't want? Chapter 1. Sold as Punishment.
I do not buy people.
The bridal chamber was larger than any space I had ever called my own. The walls were dark, almost black, and the crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling cast shadows that danced like silent ghosts. I stood in the center of that immense room, barefoot on the Persian rug that must have cost more than the house where I grew up, and I felt the soft fabric of the black lace pajamas brushing against my skin like a constant reminder of what was about to happen. My heart was beating too fast. I tried to control my breathing, but the air seemed trapped in my throat, thick and suffocating. My hands trembled slightly, so I hid them behind my back, interlacing my fingers tightly until my knuckles turned white. I couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not to him. The king-size bed dominated the room like a sacrificial altar covered in white silk sheets that contrasted cruelly with everything around it. I stared at it as if it were my sentence, trying to mentally prepare myself for what would come next. I had rehearsed this in my head 1,000 times since they said "I do" at the altar a few hours ago. Endure, comply, survive. That was all I needed to do. That was all that was left for me now that my father had sold me as if I were just another one of his failed transactions. Another desperate attempt to pay a debt he never should have incurred. The wedding had been an elegant farce, everyone smiling and toasting as if it were a celebration of love and not what it really was. Punishment disguised as an alliance. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled me from my thoughts. My entire body tensed, every muscle preparing for the inevitable. The doorknob turned with a metallic click that echoed in the heavy silence of the room, and then the door opened. He walked in. Arseny Lenski was exactly what I expected, and nothing like I imagined at the same time. His suit was still impeccable despite the hours of wedding festivities, but his tie was undone, hanging loose around the open collar of his white shirt. His dark hair was slightly messy, as if he had run his hand through it repeatedly, and his gray eyes found me across the space that separated us, with an intensity that made me swallow hard. He didn't look cruel. There was no sadism in his face, no expression of arrogant possession or predatory desire. There was only control, an absolute and terrifying control that made it impossible to read what he was thinking or feeling. It was like looking at a concrete wall and expecting to find a window. I clenched my hands into fists behind my back and raised my chin, refusing to lower my eyes even though every instinct in my body screamed for me to show submission. If he was going to break me, at least let him see that I wouldn't surrender easily. "So," I said, and my voice came out firmer than I expected, cutting through the silence between us like a blade. "The time has come." Arseny stopped in the middle of the room. His eyes studied me the way someone studies a complicated puzzle, trying to understand where each piece fits. He didn't come closer. He made no threatening move. He just stood there, occupying the space with a presence so dominant it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the air. "Time for what?" he asked, and his voice was deep, laden with a subtle Russian accent that made each word heavier, more definitive. I blinked, confused by the question. Was he really going to make me say it out loud? Was this part of the humiliation? To claim me, I answered, hating how the words sounded small and vulnerable coming out of my mouth. To collect what you bought. Something passed across his face. It was too quick for me to identify, but it seemed almost like surprise, or maybe disappointment. He began to remove his jacket with slow and deliberate movements, and each gesture seemed calculated to maintain that atmosphere of absolute control. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay still, not to back away. way. "I don't buy people," he said as he hung his jacket on the back of a nearby chair. The words were simple, direct, but they carried a weight I couldn't fully comprehend. I let out a humorless laugh, bitter and short. "Funny, that's exactly what you did." Arseny turned to me then, and for the first time since he entered the room, our eyes truly met. There was something in that gaze that made me choke on any other words I might have said. It wasn't anger, it wasn't desire. It was something deeper, more complex, something that seemed loaded with stories I didn't know, and pain I had never witnessed. He walked to the built-in closet on the wall and opened one of the doors, revealing perfectly organized shelves. He grabbed an extra pillow that was stored there and held it against his chest for a moment, before turning in my direction again. "Your father owes me loyalty," he said, and there was a coldness in those words that contrasted with the suffocating heat of the room. "Not your body." He paused, and his eyes traveled over my face as if searching for something specific. "I don't touch what doesn't choose me." The world stopped. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said, but the words didn't make sense. They didn't fit the script I had written in my head, the narrative of horror and survival I had prepared myself to face. My mouth opened, but no sound came out for several endless seconds. "What?" I finally managed to whisper, and the word came out broken, loaded with a confusion so deep it physically hurt. Arseny began walking toward the door, the pillow still in his hands, and each step he took seemed to carry away a piece of the reality I knew. He wasn't staying. He wasn't going to touch me. He was leaving? "Sleep well, Polina Lenski," he said when he reached the door, and then he stopped. He turned his head slightly, enough for me to see the sharp profile of his face illuminated by the soft light of the chandelier. "That's your name now." The sound of my new last name coming from his lips hit me like a punch to the stomach. Lenski. I was no longer Ivanov, no longer the traitor's daughter. Now I was the Pakan's wife. The wife of the man who controlled the New York Bratva with an iron fist. The wife of the man who was leaving me alone in the bridal chamber, as if I were nothing. "Wait!" The word escaped me before I could stop it, desperate and shrill. Where are you going?" Arseny opened the door, and the light from the hallway invaded the room, creating a golden halo around his silhouette. He didn't turn completely this time, just looked over his shoulder, and those gray eyes pinned me in place with an intensity that stole the air from my lungs. "Room next door," he replied, simple and direct. And then, after a pause that seemed to last an eternity, "And relax. I'm not going to do anything you don't want." The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed through the empty room like distant thunder. I stood there, frozen in the same spot where I was when he entered, staring at the closed door as if it could give me answers my confused mind couldn't form. Slowly, very slowly, my eyes moved around the bridal suite, the huge bed covered in white silk that I had stared at with so much dread minutes ago, the dark, luxurious wooden furniture that probably cost more than everything I'd ever owned in my life, the heavy velvet curtains that blocked the view of the city outside. Everything was perfect, impeccable, prepared for a traditional wedding night, but he had left. I should be feeling relief. That's what any rational person would feel, right? The monster I imagined hadn't touched me, hadn't hurt me, hadn't forced me into anything. He had respected something I didn't even know I still had the right to possess, my choice. But what I felt wasn't relief. It was frustration, a burning and confused frustration that settled in my chest, like live coals, burning beneath my skin. And along with it came something worse, something I hated to admit even to myself: disappointment. I had prepared myself to be desired, even if it were in a violent and possessive way. I had prepared myself to be important enough to provoke some reaction in him, whatever it might be. But what I received was polite indifference, clinical respect, calculated distance. And in a dark and twisted part of me, in a part I desperately wanted to deny, I had wanted it, wanted him to desire me, not as punishment or possession, but as a woman, as something beyond a business transaction or political strategy. I took a few shaky steps to the bed and sat on the edge, feeling the mattress sink slightly under my weight. My hands were still trembling, but now it was for completely different reasons. I was confused, scared in a new and strange way. Because if he didn't want me out of desire, then why had he married me? If it wasn't to use me as property, what was the real purpose of this marriage besides punishing my father? His words came back to my mind, spinning in circles like an incessant whirlpool. "Your father owes me loyalty, not your body." What did that mean exactly? What debt was this that was paid with a marriage but not with consummation? What kind of revenge was this that included respect? I lay down on the bed slowly, still dressed in the lace pajamas I had chosen, thinking they would be ripped off me. The sheets were too soft, perfumed with lavender and something more masculine that must be his scent. I wrapped myself in them as if I could protect myself from the confusion that threatened to swallow me whole. The crystal chandelier glowed softly above me, casting patterns of light that danced on the high ceiling. I watched them without really seeing, my mind wandering through dangerous and unknown territories. Who was Arseny Lenski really? What did he want from me if it wasn't my body? Why did his touch depend on my choice when I had no choice about being here? And the most disturbing question of all, the one I could barely form completely in my thoughts, why did his absence hurt more than his presence should? I turned on my side, hugging a pillow against my chest, and let my eyes wander around the room. Everything there was his territory, his domain, and now, in some twisted way, it was also mine, but not the way I expected, not in a way that made sense. "What the fuck is happening?" I whispered to the empty room, and my voice sounded small and lost in the heavy silence that surrounded me. No one answered. Of course not. I was alone in the mansion of a man who was practically a stranger, wearing his last name, sleeping in his bed, but without any of him actually present. It was like being trapped in a strange limbo between woman and ghost, wife and prisoner, desired and ignored. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out the thoughts that refused to give me peace. But even in the darkness behind my eyelids, I could see his face, those piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through me, the hard line of his jaw, the way he moved with a predatory grace that was both terrifying and magnetic. And then, in the silence of the bridal chamber where something completely different should be happening, I realized something that scared me more than any violence could. I wanted him to come back, not to hurt me, not to possess me, but simply to be there, to fill the suffocating void his absence had left, to make me feel something other than this sickening confusion that churned my stomach. I opened my eyes again and stared at the closed door. On the other side was him, in the room next door, probably lying in his own bed, alone as I was alone. Was he confused too? Did he regret the decision to leave me untouched? Or was I really that insignificant, just another piece on the chessboard of his life? The questions kept spinning in my mind without answers, each one more disturbing than the last, until finally, exhausted by the emotional tension of the day, I felt my eyes grow heavy. Sleep came slowly, reluctantly, loaded with strange dreams where strong hands almost touched me but always pulled away at the last second, where deep voices whispered promises I couldn't fully understand. And when I finally truly slept, it was with his name on my lips and a confusion in my heart that I knew, in some deep and instinctive way, would only grow from here on out, because Arseny Lenski had done something far more dangerous than possessing me. He had left me wanting to be chosen. Chapter 2, Polite Distance and Silent Attention.
You are playing with fire.
The following days dragged on in a strange routine I didn't know how to interpret. Every morning I went down to breakfast expecting to find an indifferent or hostile husband, but what I found was something far more unsettling: cold politeness and calculated distance. Arseny always arrived before me. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, Russian newspaper open in front of him, steaming cup of coffee beside him. I would enter, choose a spot strategically distant, but not far enough to seem cowardly, and nibble on toast I had no appetite to eat, while the silence weighed between us like a physical presence. "Good morning," he would say, without looking up from the newspaper. His voice was neutral, professional, as if he were greeting a coworker, and not the woman he had married a few days ago. "Good morning," I would reply, and my voice sounded too small in the enormous dining room. Then we would return to the awkward silence, broken only by the sound of the page turning and my knife scraping butter on the toast I couldn't swallow properly. "Do you need anything?" he would eventually ask, and his gray eyes would meet mine for a fraction of a second before returning to the printed news. There was no warmth there, no excessive coldness either, just nothing. "No," I would lie, because the truth was I needed answers. I needed to understand what the hell was happening. I needed to know why he treated me like an inconvenient guest instead of a wife, but the words got stuck in my throat, choked by pride and fear of seeming needy. "Good night," he would say at the end of each day, usually finding me briefly in the hallway or library before disappearing into the room next to mine. And then I was alone again, staring at the ceiling while trying to decipher the enigma that was my husband. But despite the deliberate distance, despite the conversations that never went beyond the necessary, I began to notice things, small things that didn't make sense with the narrative of indifference he was trying to build. On the first day after the wedding night, I woke up with a strange feeling. Something was different, but it took me a few sleepy minutes to identify what. The mattress. It was softer, more welcoming, molding perfectly to my body in a way the previous one didn't. I found it odd, but thought maybe it had just been emotional exhaustion making me imagine differences where there were none. Until the housekeeper came in to tidy the room, and I, moved by a curiosity I couldn't contain, asked, "Why did they change the mattress?" The older woman, with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and kind eyes that contrasted with the severity of the rest of the house, hesitated for a moment. Her hands stopped mid-gesture of smoothing the sheets, and she looked at me with an expression that bordered on compassion. "Mr. Lenski ordered it," she finally answered, and there was something in her voice that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "He said that you weren't sleeping well." The words hit me like a bucket of cold water. How did he know? know? He hadn't even entered the room since the first night. Unless he was paying attention in ways I didn't notice. Unless his distance wasn't as complete as it seemed. On the second day, I noticed that the somber portraits decorating the walls of the bridal chamber had disappeared. They were old paintings of stern men who seemed to judge me from atop their gilded frames, their penetrating eyes following me around the room. I had tried to ignore them, but at night, they made me uncomfortable, as if I were being watched by ghosts of the Lenski family's past. Now the walls were empty in those spaces. Only the dark wallpaper revealed where there had once been disturbing art. No one said anything. No one explained. But I knew, deep down, that this was no coincidence. Someone had noticed my discomfort, and that someone could only be him. The third day brought the most obvious change. I had gone down to breakfast and crossed paths with one of the security guards in the hallway, a stocky man with dark eyes who usually stood positioned near the bridal chamber. He had looked at me in a way that made me uncomfortable in the previous days, a look that lingered too long, assessed too much, that made me want to cover more skin, even when I was already fully dressed. But that morning, he wasn't there. In his place was a different man, older, with a professional expression, and eyes that barely strayed from his post. The change was so striking I couldn't let it pass. I found Maxime, Arsenie's right-hand man whom I had seen a few times around the mansion, in the library later. He was a middle-aged man with harsh features, but eyes that occasionally revealed something close to humor. He seemed to be one of the few people in the house who didn't treat me like I was made of glass, or like I was an unwanted intruder. "Maxime," I called to him, trying to sound casual despite my racing heart. "Why did Igor leave?" He was organizing some books on a shelf and stopped mid-movement. He turned slowly to me, and the expression on his face was one of genuine embarrassment, as if I had asked a question whose answer he preferred not to give. "He was looking," Maxime said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Too much. At boss's wife." The air left my lungs all at once. My brain processed the information in layers, each more revealing than the last. Arsenie had noticed, had cared enough to act, had protected my dignity even while maintaining that polite distance between us. "I see," I murmured, but my mind was miles away, spinning with the implications of what I had just discovered. On Thursday afternoon, restlessness finally won over my restraint. I had spent the last few days exploring the mansion like an animal in a gilded cage, learning every hallway, every room, trying to map the limits of my new prison. But there was one place I had avoided until then, his office. It was obviously forbidden territory, the door always closed, occasional sounds of tense conversations in Russian leaking from beneath it. But that day, moved by a combination of curiosity, frustration, and a growing need to understand the man I was trapped with, I decided to invade. I didn't knock. It was an impulse, a small rebellion against all the forced politeness and unspoken boundaries. I simply turned the doorknob and pushed the door, entering Arsenie Lenski's private sanctuary without permission or invitation. The office was exactly what I expected, and nothing like I imagined at the same time. Dark, masculine, dominated by an enormous desk of fine wood covered with documents and a computer screen displaying something in Cyrillic characters. The walls were decorated with family portraits, stern faces looking down with silent judgment, and a detailed map of New York, marked with pins and notes that clearly outlined territory. There were weapons, too. A glass display case showing old and modern pistols, knives of various sizes, even something that looked like a decorative sword but was probably deadly anyway. It was a visual reminder of the world I had entered, of the kind of man who now held the title of my husband. Arsenie was sitting behind the desk, pen in hand, eyes focused on some important document. When the door opened without the warning of a knock, his head lifted abruptly. The expression that crossed his face was one of rare, genuine irritation, not filtered by the mask of control he usually wore. "You knock on doors," he said, and his voice was sharp, cutting, laden with an authority that probably made grown men tremble. Something in me, some stupid and self-sabotaging part, decided I wasn't going to back down. "Sorry," I said, but it didn't sound the least bit apologetic. I was curious. I saw him fight against the irritation, watching the muscles in his jaw tense as he slowly regained control over his emotions. When he spoke again, his voice was more controlled, but there was still an edge there. I took a few steps into the office, my eyes wandering over the decor, over the symbols of power and violence that occupied every inch of that space. "About you," I answered honestly, and then let my arm make a wide gesture that encompassed everything around. "About this, how it works. It works with discipline," he said, each word pronounced with deliberate precision. "Order, hierarchy." He paused, and his eyes pierced mine with an intensity that made me forget to breathe for a second. "Things your father forgot." The mention of my father was like a slap. My entire body tensed, defensive, ready to attack even knowing it was a losing battle. "My father," I began, but the words died in my throat because I didn't know how to defend him, didn't know if he deserved defense. "It's not your fault," Arseny said, and his voice became marginally softer, as if he had realized he had stepped on painful ground. "His sins, but I pay for them," I replied, and the bitterness in my words was so thick I could almost taste it on my tongue. Something passed across his face then, something that seemed dangerously close to understanding or maybe even compassion. "Yes," he admitted after a heavy pause. "You pay." The silence that settled between us was different from the silences at breakfast. This one was loaded, dense with things unsaid and questions unasked. I could hear the tick-tock of a wall clock somewhere, marking the seconds that stretched like elastic about to snap. "Can I ask you something?" I finally said, breaking the silence before it broke me. "You can ask," he replied, leaning back in the leather chair and crossing his arms over his chest. "I may not answer." I took a deep breath, gathering courage to ask the question that had been tormenting me since the wedding night. "Why didn't you touch me?" On the first night, I saw his body tense, when all his muscles contracted as if I had landed a physical blow. His eyes narrowed slightly, analyzing my face as if trying to figure out what was behind the question. It was clearly something he didn't expect me to ask, something that caught him off guard. "Because revenge doesn't need to include rape," he said finally, and the brutal honesty of the words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "Revenge?" I repeated, and my voice came out strange, shrill, laden with a shock I couldn't hide. "Marrying you was strategy," he continued, and each word was a knife being carefully stuck between my ribs. "Not desire." He paused for what seemed like an eternity, and when he spoke again, his voice had a different quality. Deeper. "Your father owes me more than money." My heart was beating so hard I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. "Owes you what?" I asked, even though I already feared the answer. His eyes met mine, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something in them beyond control and calculated coldness. I saw vulnerability, only for seconds, just a flash before he recovered his armor, but it was enough to leave me breathless. "My mother," he said, and then he stood abruptly, walking around the desk toward the door with long, determined steps. I stood frozen, watching him leave his own office, as if my presence had become unbearable. The door closed behind him, and only then did my legs remember how to function. I stumbled to the chair he had just vacated and let myself fall into it, the leather still warm from the heat of his body. "His mother?" I whispered to the empty room, trying to process what that meant, trying to connect the dots of a story I clearly didn't know. My father owed Arseny his mother. The words spun in my head, each repetition bringing new layers of horror and understanding. What had happened to his mother, and what role had my father played in it? Chapter 3. Unconscious Provocations.
I am watching you.
The following week brought a subtle change in my behavior that I barely noticed as it was happening. It was as if something inside me had awakened, some rebellious and stubborn part that refused to accept the polite distance Arseny maintained between us. I began testing the boundaries without fully realizing what I was doing, provoking reactions from him in ways that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried an intention I wasn't ready to admit. It started on an ordinary morning. I had woken up early, unable to fall back asleep after another night disturbed by confusing dreams, involving gray eyes and half-spoken words. I went down to the kitchen before formal breakfast, still dressed in my robe, but deciding to change into something more presentable before the housekeeper or any other employee saw me that way. I chose a dress from the closet that had been stocked with expensive clothes I never asked for. It was tight, hugging my body in a way I would normally avoid, but that morning something in me decided I didn't care. I let my hair down, letting it fall in natural waves over my shoulders, and went back down to the kitchen. The kitchen was huge, fully equipped with state-of-the-art appliances that gleamed under the recessed lighting. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, so I felt free to explore. I went to the tall cabinet where the sugar was kept, but the canister was on the highest shelf, obviously placed there by someone much taller than me. I stretched up on my tiptoes, extending my arm to reach it, and felt the dress ride dangerously up my thigh. I didn't think much of it. I was focused on not knocking the damn sugar canister onto the floor when I heard the almost imperceptible sound of footsteps stopping abruptly at the kitchen entrance. I turned my head, still stretched on my tiptoes, arm extended, and found Arseny standing in the doorway. He had frozen mid-movement, his eyes fixed on my exposed legs where the dress had ridden up. It wasn't a casual glance. It was intense, hungry, the kind of look that made the room's temperature rise a few degrees. I grabbed the sugar canister and came down from my toes, turning completely to face him with an expression I tried to make look genuinely surprised. "Oh, good morning. Didn't hear you." I saw him blink, as if waking from a trance, and his jaw locked as he quickly looked away. "Good morning," he replied, his voice slightly hoarse, and went straight to the coffee maker without looking at me again. I suppressed a smile that threatened to appear, so he wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. That look had been real, visceral, impossible to fake or completely hide. It was the first real crack in his armor, and something inside me wanted to poke at that crack until it opened completely. "The coffee's fresh," I said, keeping my voice light and casual as I approached the counter where he was standing. I made it. He grabbed a cup and filled it quickly, his movements efficient but slightly tense. "Thanks," he murmured, and was already turning to leave the kitchen, clearly planning a quick escape. "Arseny?" I called before I could stop myself, and I saw him pause mid-stride, his shoulders becoming visibly tense under his impeccable white shirt. "Yes?" The word came out controlled, careful. I took a few more steps toward him, closing the distance between us in a way that wasn't exactly threatening, but also wasn't completely innocent. "Are you running away from me?" He turned slowly, and when his eyes met mine, there was something in them that made me swallow hard. It wasn't anger. It was something more dangerous. "I don't run from anything," he said, and there was an edge of warning in his voice. "Then why do you always leave when I come in?" I asked, tilting my head slightly to the side and watching the micro-expressions that passed across his face. His jaw moved, clenching and relaxing, as if he were chewing on the words before letting them out. "Because it's safer," he finally admitted, his voice low and controlled. "For both of us." And then he left before I could respond, leaving me alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in my hand and a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. That afternoon, I found myself in the library. It was quickly becoming my favorite place in the mansion, a quiet refuge full of books in Russian, English, and even some in other languages I didn't recognize. The shelves went from floor to ceiling, and there was an old, rolling ladder to reach the higher volumes. It was the kind of library people dreamed of having, and I lost myself there for hours. I was curled up in a leather armchair near the window, a book open in my lap, when I heard the door open. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I was already starting to recognize the sound of his footsteps, the way he moved through space with that silent grace that was more intimidating than any noise could be. The dress I was wearing had a more daring neckline than usual. It hadn't been a conscious choice when I got dressed that morning, or at least that's what I told myself. It was simply what was clean and available in the closet. But now, with Arseny in the room, I was hyper-aware of every inch of exposed skin. He stopped when he saw me, and I pretended not to notice, keeping my eyes fixed on the pages of the book, even though the words had turned into incomprehensible blurs. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and penetrating, making my skin tingle with awareness. "Is there something you need here?" I asked without looking up from the book, trying to keep my voice neutral despite my racing heart. He didn't answer immediately. I heard his footsteps moving around the room, heading toward one of the shelves far from where I was. "Reports," he finally said, the words short and without elaboration. "Can I keep reading?" I asked, still not looking at him. "You can." The answer came quickly, but something in his voice sounded tense. 15 minutes passed in silence. 15 minutes during which I pretended to read while every cell in my body was painfully aware of his presence. He had gotten the documents he needed. I knew that, because I had heard the sound of papers being removed from the drawer, but he hadn't left. He remained there, a solid and disturbing presence in my peripheral vision. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I closed the book with a soft snap and raised my eyes to find him leaning against the table in the center of the room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me with an intensity that stole the air from my lungs. "Are you just going to stand there?" I asked, and the question came out with more challenge than I intended. "I'm working," he replied, but there were no documents in his hands. There was nothing but those gray eyes piercing through me. "You're watching me," I corrected, closing the book completely and placing it on the side table. "I'm being vigilant," he said, but the justification sounded weak even to my ears. I got up from the armchair, leaving the book behind, and began walking toward the door. I had to pass by him to leave, and something rebellious inside me decided not to deviate, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing me back down. When I was about to pass, so close I could feel the heat emanating from his body, he moved. His hand closed around my wrist, not with force, but with enough firmness to stop me in place. The touch was like electricity running through my skin, making my heart race and my breathing fail. It was his first real touch since the wedding night, and it was so much more intense than I had imagined. "Vigilant against what?" I asked, my voice coming out lower, huskier than I intended. "Me running away?" His fingers tightened slightly around my wrist, his thumb finding my racing pulse, and I saw his eyes narrow slightly, registering the way my body was reacting to his proximity. "Against you," he said, and his voice was so low it was almost a growl. "Against me?" I repeated, turning completely to face him. We were too close now, much too close, and I could see the golden particles in his gray eyes, could count every dark lash, could feel his breath brushing my face. He pulled my wrist slightly, bringing me even closer, and now there were only inches between our bodies. "You're playing with fire, Polina," he said, and there was a warning in his voice that made something in my stomach contract. But I was tired of warnings, tired of distance, tired of pretending I didn't feel what we both clearly felt. "You don't look burned," I said, and my voice came out as a challenge. I saw the exact moment his control wavered. His eyes narrowed, his jaw locked, his breathing became heavier. He leaned in slightly, further closing the distance between us, and I thought he was finally going to kiss me. I thought all the weeks of tension and unspoken games were finally going to culminate in something real and tangible. Our faces were so close I could feel the heat of his skin, could see the pulse beating on the side of his neck, could almost taste the promise of the kiss that was about to happen. His breathing was heavy, matching mine, and the air between us was charged with an electricity that made my skin tingle. But then, abruptly, he pulled away. He released my wrist, as if it had burned him, and took 2 large steps back, creating a physical distance that felt like an abyss after the closeness of seconds before. The expression on his face was one of pure determination, as if he had fought an internal battle and forced himself to win against his own will. "No," he said, and the word was firm, final. "This isn't going to happen." The rejection hurt more than I expected. It felt like a punch to the chest, stealing the air from my lungs and making my eyes burn with tears I refused to let fall. "Why not?" I asked, and I hated how my voice came out weak, wounded. "Because I'm a traitor's daughter? Because if it happens," he began, running his hand through his hair in a frustrated gesture that made him seem more human, more accessible. "It won't be strategy, it'll be real, and that," he paused, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless, "changes everything." And then he left, leaving me trembling in the middle of the library, my wrist still tingling where he had touched me, my heart beating out of rhythm, my mind spinning with the implications of what he had just admitted. I stood there for long minutes after he was gone, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand the confusion of emotions tearing through me. Anger because he kept pushing me away, frustration because I wanted something he refused to give, confusion because I didn't understand why this mattered so much to me. But above all, there was fear. Fear because I was starting to realize a truth I preferred to deny. I was starting to care about him in ways that went far beyond mere curiosity or superficial physical attraction. I was starting to want not just for him to desire me, but to truly choose me, and that was dangerous. More dangerous than any physical violence could be. "Shit," I whispered to the empty library, wrapping my arms around myself in an embrace that offered no real comfort. Because Arseny Lenski was right. If that happened, if we crossed that invisible line he fought so desperately to maintain, everything would change. And I wasn't sure I was ready to deal with the consequences of that change. But as I stood there, still feeling the ghost of his touch on my wrist, I also realized another equally frightening truth. I wanted it to change. I wanted to cross that line. I wanted to see what was on the other side of the carefully maintained distance. And I had no idea how to stop wanting. Chapter 4. Lost Control and Iron Discipline.
No one disrespects my wife.
The days following the incident in the library were different. Arseny changed, or maybe I was just finally seeing what had always been there. A man fighting an internal war with himself and losing ground with each passing day. He became darker, more distant, building even higher walls around himself as if he could protect himself from whatever he was feeling. He began actively avoiding me in ways that were almost comical if they weren't so painfully obvious. He woke before dawn and was already out of the mansion when I came down for breakfast, leaving only an empty cup and the folded newspaper as evidence he had been there. He returned late at night, when I was already locked in the bridal chamber, and I would hear his tired footsteps in the hallway passing right by my door toward his room. It was like living with a ghost, a presence I knew existed, but that refused to materialize in front of me. I should have been relieved by the space, by the freedom of not having to deal with that constant tension between us. But I wasn't. I was frustrated, irritated, and inexplicably hurt by the way he had chosen to deal with what had happened between us. But as much as he avoided my physical presence, I began to notice other signs that I wasn't as irrelevant as he wanted it to seem. Small gestures, subtle changes that revealed that even from a distance, he was still paying attention in ways that left me confused and strangely warmed. The flowers that appeared in my room, not cliché red roses or anything obvious, but delicate white lilies that filled the air with a soft perfume. The housekeeper didn't know where they came from, or at least pretended not to know. The new books that appeared in the library, all in English, all in the genres I had been reading. The room temperature that was adjusted to exactly how I liked it after a night when I complained about the cold, to no one in particular. He was watching me. Even while avoiding me, he was paying attention to every detail, every preference, every little thing that could make me more comfortable. And that was more disturbing than any direct confrontation could be, because it showed a level of care that didn't match the narrative of revenge and strategy he had built. It was on a Thursday afternoon that everything changed again. I was coming down the main staircase, lost in my own thoughts, when I heard voices coming from the entrance hall. Male voices, rough, speaking in Russian, at a speed that made it impossible for me to understand the individual words, even though I had started learning some basic terms. I recognized Arsenie's voice immediately, that deep and controlled timbre that was already engraved in my memory. But there was another voice too, louder, more casual, laden with a type of arrogance that made me stop in the middle of the stairs, hidden from view, but able to hear everything. The conversation switched to English abruptly, probably when they realized they were in a more public space of the house. It was one of the Bratva captains. I recognized his face in passing, a large man with a scar on his face and cold eyes that always made me uncomfortable. "Boss bought expensive wife," the man said, and there was a tone of cruel amusement in his voice that made my stomach churn. "Hope she's worth the price." The silence that followed was so absolute. I could hear my own heart beating in my ears. I held my breath, my body becoming completely still on the stairs, and waited for Arsenie's response. I expected him to ignore it, to treat it like the idiotic comment it was, and move forward with icy dignity. What I didn't expect was the explosion. The sound of a body being thrown against the wall echoed through the hall like thunder. I heard the impact, the grunt of surprised pain, and then Arsenie's voice, low and deadly, in a way that made my skin crawl. "Talk about my wife again," he said, and each word dripped concentrated poison. "And you disappear forever." I moved instinctively, descending a few more steps until I could see what was happening through the ornate balusters. Arsenie had the man suspended against the wall, one hand closed around his throat, feet barely touching the floor. The captain's face was red, eyes wide with genuine fear, hands gripping Arsenie's wrist in a futile attempt to relieve the pressure. "Sorry, boss," the man managed to choke out, his voice coming out strangled and desperate. "Didn't mean to offend, I was just joking, I swear I didn't mean." "You did," Arsenie interrupted, squeezing the man's throat harder. "And now think twice, before breathing near her." He released the man abruptly, letting him collapse to the floor in a pathetic heap of coughing and gasping. The captain dragged himself away, stumbling as he stood, and ran out of the mansion without looking back. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the space, followed by a heavy silence that seemed to vibrate with contained violence. Arsenie stood there for long seconds, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his shoulders tense under the dark suit. I saw him run his hand over his face, breathing deeply as if trying to regain the control he had momentarily lost. My heart was racing, beating so hard it felt like it wanted to leap from my chest. He had done that for me, had lost control, that precious and absolute control he maintained over himself, because someone had disrespected me. It wasn't about family honor or Bratva code. It was personal. It was about me. I descended the rest of the stairs silently, but he must have heard my footsteps because he turned abruptly, his eyes meeting mine across the hall. There was something wild in them, something not completely controlled, and it made something in my stomach contract in a way that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. "How much did you hear?" he asked, his voice still rough around the edges. "Everything," I admitted, seeing no reason to lie. I walked toward him, closing the distance with measured steps, and stopped a few feet from where he stood. "You won't touch me, but you'll kill for me." I saw his jaw lock, watched him fight to regain that mask of indifference he wore so well. "Nobody disrespects Lenski," he said, but the justification sounded mechanical, rehearsed. "Including wife. Is that all?" I pressed, taking another step toward him. "Family honor?" His eyes narrowed, and when he spoke, there was an edge of warning in his voice that made my skin tingle. "Don't test me, Polina." But I was tired of not testing, tired of pretending I didn't see what was happening between us. "Why not?" I asked, and my voice came out more challenging than I intended. "You test me, every day, looking, wanting, but never touching." He moved so fast I didn't have time to react. One second he was meters away, the next he was right there in front of me, invading my personal space with a presence so dominant it stole the air from my lungs. He didn't touch me, but he didn't need to. The proximity was enough to make every nerve ending in my body ignite. "Because if I touch," he said, his voice so low it was almost a growl, "I won't stop." The heat that took over me was instant and overwhelming. My entire body reacted to those words, to the implicit promise in them, to the way he looked at me as if he were fighting an internal battle between what he wanted and what he allowed himself to have. "What if I don't want you to stop?" I asked, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I said the words out loud. Something passed through his eyes, something dark and hungry that made my stomach flip. He took a step even closer, eliminating any safe space between us, and now I could feel the heat emanating from his body, could see every detail of his face from how close I was. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said, but there was less conviction in the words now, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as me. "Then show me," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on his, refusing to back down or look away. I saw the moment he almost gave in, the moment when all the walls he had built so carefully around himself began to crack. His hand rose, trembling slightly, going toward my face as if moved by its own will. His fingers were inches from my cheek when the shrill sound of the phone ringing cut through the moment like a knife. His hand froze in the air between us. I saw frustration cross his face, followed by something that seemed dangerously close to relief. He pulled away abruptly, creating physical distance while taking his cell phone from his pocket with rigid movements. "What?" he answered, and the irritation in his voice was palpable even through the forced control. I couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying, but I saw when his expression changed from irritation to something more serious. His shoulders became more tense, his jaw locked, and the eyes that seconds ago had been fixed on me now looked at some distant point. 2 hours, he finally said, and hung up without ceremony. "There's always something," I said, and the bitterness in my voice was impossible to hide. He put away the phone and looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't fully decipher. Regret, maybe, or frustration, or both mixed with a dozen other emotions he refused to name. "There is," he agreed, walking toward the door. "And there always will be." He stopped with his hand on the doorknob, his back turned to me, and when he spoke again his voice was lower, more tired. "It's my life, Polina, not ours." The words hit me like a slap. "I see," I said, and the hurt in my voice was too evident to be hidden. He turned his head slightly, not enough to really look at me, but enough for me to see the tense profile of his face. "No, you don't understand, but maybe that's better." And then he left, leaving me alone in the empty hall, still trembling from the proximity we had shared, still feeling the ghost of his almost touch hovering between us. My entire body seemed to vibrate with unresolved energy, my heart beat out of rhythm, and my mind spun with 1,000 contradictory thoughts. "Idiot," I whispered to the empty space, wrapping my arms around myself. "We're both idiots," because he was right about one thing. I didn't understand. I didn't understand how he could want me so obviously and deny himself so completely. I didn't understand how we could have so much between us and still be separated by distances that seemed insurmountable. I didn't understand why every step we took toward each other seemed to come accompanied by 2 steps back. But what I did understand, with painful and frightening clarity, was that this couldn't continue. Something would have to give eventually. Either his distance, my restraint, or the walls we had both built around ourselves. Something would have to break. And at times like these, there's always a question that affects many couples. Who gives in or breaks first? Chapter 5. Devastating Discovery.
Now you know.
Curiosity was a dangerous thing. I knew that theoretically, had grown up hearing warnings about curious cats and their premature deaths, but abstract knowledge was nothing compared to the real compulsion that consumed me. Arsenie's words echoed in my head constantly, spinning in endless circles that kept me from sleeping at night. Your father owes me more than money. My mother. What did that mean? What role had my father played in his mother's death? And why did Arsenie carry it like an open wound that not even time had managed to completely heal? The questions tormented me, growing in intensity with each passing day, until I finally made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out the truth, even if I had to invade forbidden places and violate his privacy to do it. Even if the truth was something I didn't want to know. I waited until I was sure Arsenie had left. I heard the sound of his car leaving the property early in the morning, saw through my bedroom window when the gate closed behind the dark vehicle, and then counted to 1,000 mentally to be absolutely sure he wouldn't come back for something forgotten. My heart beat fast as I descended the stairs, each step seeming too loud, each creak of the wooden floor sounding like an alarm. His office was at the end of the first-floor hallway, behind a heavy mahogany door that always remained closed when he wasn't there. I had invaded once before, but that occasion had been impulsive, driven by momentary curiosity. This was different. This was premeditated, intentional, and loaded with a weight that made me feel sick with anxiety. The doorknob turned easily under my hand. He didn't lock the door, apparently confident that no one in the house would be stupid enough to enter without permission. Except me, apparently. Except the wife he kept at a distance but who refused to accept the barriers he built. The office was exactly as I remembered. Dark, masculine, dominated by his presence even in physical absence. I went straight to the desk, my fingers trembling slightly as I began opening drawers. The first had only administrative documents, boring things about properties and legitimate investments that served as a facade for the real business. The second had weapons, several of them, organized with meticulous care. It was in the third drawer, the deepest on the right side, that I found what I was looking for. A thick folder, edges worn from frequent handling, with a title written in firm handwriting on top, Death of Elena Lenski, 1998. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the folder as I took it from the drawer. I placed it on the desk with excessive care, as if it were a bomb that could explode at any moment, and breathed deeply several times before I could open it. The air seemed too thick in my lungs, sticky and insufficient. The first thing I saw was a photo. A beautiful woman, dark hair pulled back in an elegant hairstyle, soft smile and kind eyes that contrasted with the harshness of the world to which she belonged. Elena Lenski, Arseni's mother. She couldn't have been more than 40 in the photo. Too young to be dead, too young to have been torn from her son so violently. Below the photo were documents. Police reports written in Russian with translations stapled alongside, witness statements, photos of the scene that I quickly turned face down because I couldn't look at that carnage. And then, buried in the middle of everything, a document that made my world completely crumble. Source of information: Viktor Ivanov, internal accountant for the Volkov organization, provided transport route and specific times to rival family in exchange for financial compensation of $50,000. Information resulted in ambush that caused death of Elena Lenski, wife of then Pakhan Dmitry Lenski. Viktor Ivanov subsequently fled to the United States under protection of FBI contacts. My hand flew to my mouth, muffling the sound that tried to escape. It wasn't a scream, wasn't exactly a sob. It was something between the two, something broken and desperate that came from a place too deep to name. My father. My own father had sold the information that led to her death. I continued reading with eyes blurred by tears that refused to fall, searching for something, anything, that would make this less horrible. But each document I turned only made everything worse. Additional photos showing the destroyed car, autopsy reports detailing every injury, and then a paragraph that made me stop completely. Elena Lenski used own body to protect son Arseny, 15 years old, from bullets during attack. Son survived with minor injuries. Mother died instantly from head trauma. She had died saving him, had placed herself between the bullets and her teenage son, sacrificing her own life so he could live. And all because of information my father had sold for dirty money. $50,000. That was the price he had put on her life. That was the sum for which he had destroyed a family and stained mine in a way that could never be cleaned. There were more documents in the folder, but my hands were shaking so much now I could barely hold the papers. I forced myself to continue, to read everything, to absorb every horrible detail of the tragedy my father had caused. And then, almost at the bottom of the folder, I found something that broke me completely. A letter, written in awkward English, clearly translated from Russian, or written by someone who didn't fully master the language. The handwriting was familiar in a way that made me feel physically sick. It was my father's handwriting. Lenski, I'm sorry about Elena. She wasn't supposed to die. It was just information about shipments. Didn't know she would be in the car. Thought it was just business, not family. Please don't tell Polina. She's innocent in all this. Don't let her carry the weight of what I did. It's the only thing I ask. The letter had no date, no signature, but it was his. I recognized every stroke, every word chosen with that particular way of speaking my father always had. He knew what he had done, knew the consequences, and had spent years keeping it secret from me, protecting me from the truth as if ignorance could somehow absolve me of guilt. But I didn't feel absolved. I felt dirty. Stained by association, carrying a weight I didn't know existed, but that now threatened to crush me completely. The tears finally came, hot and unstoppable, streaming down my face as I held that pathetic letter in my trembling hands. Dad, no, I whispered to the empty office, my voice breaking on the second word. Please, no. But the words printed on the paper didn't change. The truth didn't disappear just because I desperately wanted it not to be real. My father was responsible for the death of Arseny's mother. And I, by extension, was the daughter of the man who had destroyed his life in the most cruel way possible. Suddenly everything made sense. The forced marriage, the careful distance, the way Arseny sometimes looked at me, as if he were fighting an internal battle between what he felt and what he thought he should feel. I wasn't just a strategic punishment for my father. I was a living reminder of the worst loss Arseny had suffered. The sound of the door opening caught me completely off guard. I was so lost in pain and discovery that I hadn't even heard approaching footsteps. My head lifted abruptly, red and swollen eyes from crying meeting Arseny's icy gaze standing in the office entrance. The expression on his face was one of pure controlled fury. It wasn't the explosive anger he had shown with the captain who disrespected me. It was something colder, more dangerous, the kind of anger that smart people fled from instead of confronting. His eyes went from mine to the open folder on the desk, to the scattered documents, to the letter still in my hands. Looking for something specific? He asked, and his voice was so icy I felt a shiver run down my spine. I wiped the tears from my face with the back of my free hand in a useless gesture, because new tears were already falling to replace the ones I had wiped away. "Arseny," I began, but my voice came out broken, unstable. I didn't know. About her. About what my father did. "Your mother," he said, and there was a sharp edge in his voice that cut deeper than any physical knife could. "No, your mother," I corrected desperately, dropping the letter on the desk and gesturing to the scattered documents. "Elena. Dad sold information that caused her death. She died because of us." The silence that followed was absolutely deadly. Arseny didn't move from the door, but his presence seemed to fill the entire office, heavy and threatening in a way that made the air thick. I could see the muscles in his jaw moving, clenching and relaxing, as he fought to maintain control over whatever he was feeling. "Now you know," he finally said, and the words were simple but loaded with the weight of years of unresolved pain. "Now I understand," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I paused, breathing deeply before continuing. "Why you hate me. Why marrying me was perfect revenge. Daughter of your mother's killer." Something passed through his eyes then, something too complex for me to fully name. "I should hate you," he said, and began moving through the office toward me with slow, measured steps. "But you don't," I said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement, a certainty I felt deep in my bones despite all logic suggesting otherwise. He stopped a few steps from me, close enough for me to see the details of his face, far enough to maintain some illusion of safe distance. "That's the problem," he admitted, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was real vulnerability in his voice. "It would be easier if I did." "Arseny," I began, reaching my hand toward him in an instinctive gesture of comfort, or connection, or anything that could diminish the abyss that seemed to have opened between us. "Do you feel dirty now?" he asked, and his voice became lower, rougher. "Part of the pain they caused?" He leaned slightly toward me, his eyes piercing mine. "Good, because I've felt this way for 12 years. The cruelty of the words hit me like a physical punch, stealing the air from my lungs, but I deserved it. Deserved that, and worse. "I'm sorry," I said, and the words came out broken by sobs I could no longer contain. "For her, for you, for everything my father destroyed." "I don't want your pity," he said, but there was less conviction in the words now, as if he were fighting against himself as much as against me. "It's not pity," I practically shouted, frustration and pain finally overflowing into something close to anger. "It's guilt. Real. True. I carry the last name of the man who killed your mother." He looked at me for a long moment, really looked at me, as if he were seeing something he hadn't noticed before. The anger began to drain from his face slowly, being replaced by something softer, more confused. "You really didn't know," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Of course not," I replied, my voice still too loud, loaded with too much emotion. "You think I would agree to marry knowing my family killed your mother? That I would sleep at night knowing what my father did?" Silence fell between us again, but this one was different. It wasn't loaded with anger or accusation, but with something heavier, more complex. Arseny ran his hand over his face in a tired gesture, and when he spoke again his voice was softer, almost gentle. "Your father never told you," he said, and it wasn't an accusation, it was just an observation. A bitter laugh escaped me. Without any humor, he protected me from the truth, like he always did. I wiped more tears, looking at the documents scattered on the desk. "And now I understand why you won't touch me. I'm a living reminder of what you lost." "It's not that," he said quickly, and there was an urgency in the words that made me look at him again. "It is," I insisted, because it all made sense now, all the distance and all the rejections finally having a logical explanation. "No!" he practically roared, and then suddenly he was there, hands on my shoulders, holding me firmly enough to be impossible to ignore, but not enough to hurt. It was his first real touch since that moment in the library, and it made every nerve ending in my body ignite despite the horrible circumstances. "I don't touch you because," he began, and then paused, as if the next words were physically difficult to say, "because when I look at you I forget. The pain, the anger, what your father did, and that," his voice became even lower, more intense, "scares me more than any enemy." My heart stopped, simply stopped in my chest as I processed what he had just admitted. He didn't avoid me out of hatred, or because he couldn't bear my presence. He avoided me because he could bear it too much, because I did something to him that made it impossible to keep the anger alive the way he thought he needed to. "Arseny," I whispered, but I didn't know what to say after his name. There were no adequate words for the whirlwind of emotions spinning inside me. His hands on my shoulders squeezed slightly before releasing me, and he took a step back, as if he needed the distance to think clearly. "You should hate me," he said, for what I did to you, for bringing you into this, for using you as a weapon against your own father. But I don't hate you, I admitted, and the words came out easier than expected. I can't, no matter how much I try. We stood there, separated by a few steps, but it could have been an ocean, looking at each other through the space loaded with revelations and unresolved emotions. Everything had changed in the last few minutes. The fragile balance we had maintained was completely destroyed, and there was no going back to what we were before, because now I knew the truth, and he knew that I knew, and neither of us could pretend anymore that it didn't matter. The bridge has been burned. Are our protagonists ready for what comes next? I guarantee you, it won't be easy. Chapter 6. Near Surrender.
You think you can get away with this?
Arseni's hands were still on my shoulders, the heat of them burning through the thin fabric of my blouse. It wasn't a casual or consoling touch. It was firm, possessive in a way he probably hadn't admitted even to himself, and it made every cell in my body vibrate with awareness. I could feel the strength contained in those fingers, the way he fought between pulling me closer or releasing me completely. Arseny, I said, and his name came out like a sigh, loaded with all the confused emotions spinning inside me. He didn't answer immediately, just looked at me with that intensity that was already becoming familiar, as if he were trying to read my soul through my eyes. And then, when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher, laden with a brutal honesty that left me breathless. "You make me forget who I am," he said, and each word seemed torn from him with difficulty. And a man like me can't forget, not for a second. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could feel it through his touch, could hear it in the heavy silence between us. "Why not?" I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I intended. "Because forgetting means dying," he replied without hesitation, as if it were an absolute truth engraved in his core. "In this world." Slowly, hesitantly, I raised my hand and placed it on his chest. I felt his heart beating hard under my palm, as fast as mine, proving that no matter how controlled he seemed on the surface, inside he was as affected as I was. The fabric of his shirt was warm under my fingers, and I could feel the tense muscles underneath, rigid with the effort of maintaining control. "What if for one night," I said, and my voice trembled slightly on the words, "you weren't Pakan, just a man?" His eyes fell to where my hand rested on his chest, and I saw when his breathing became heavier, more irregular, his jaw locked, muscles jumping under his skin, and I knew he was fighting a fierce internal battle. "Polina," he said, and my name in his voice sounded like both a warning and a plea. "Just one night," I continued, moving closer, eliminating the space between us until there was nothing but charged air and unspoken possibilities. "No Bratva, no past, no revenge, just us." "It doesn't work that way," he said, but there was less conviction in the words now, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as me. I leaned even closer, my mouth near enough to his ear that my breath brushed his skin when I whispered, "It works if you let it." The effect was immediate. I felt when his entire body tensed, when his breath caught for a second before returning heavier. Slowly, so slowly I thought I was imagining it, he began to lean toward me. His face approached mine, torturous inch by inch, until our lips were millimeters apart. I could feel his breath mixing with mine, warm and irregular. I could see every detail of his face from so close. The golden particles in his gray eyes, the fine lines around his eyes that told stories of tension and responsibility. My own eyes began to close, preparing myself for the kiss that would finally happen. For the moment, we would cross that invisible line he had fought so desperately to maintain. And then the thunder came. It was so loud, so sudden, that the sound seemed to crack the sky in half. My entire body jumped instinctively, pulling away from Arseny before my brain could fully process what had happened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the office into darkness that was only broken by the occasional lightning outside. My heart was racing for completely different reasons now. The fear was instant and irrational, a childhood phobia I had never fully overcome. Storms always made me nervous, but loud thunder like that terrified me in a primitive way that no logic or adult age could diminish. "You're afraid of storms," Arseny said, and it wasn't a question. It was an observation, made with that tone of someone who had just discovered another piece of the puzzle that was me. I tried to recover some dignity, straightening my posture and breathing deeply. "Since childhood," I admitted, hating how my voice came out small. "Stupid, I know." Another thunder rolled through the sky, this one even louder, and I couldn't control the tremor that ran through my body. It wasn't just fright, it was a visceral fear that made my stomach churn and my hands shake. I wrapped my arms around myself in a futile attempt to seem more composed. Arseny watched me for a moment, those gray eyes studying my face even in the dimness, and then, surprising me completely, he made a decision. He took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a way that was both comforting and too intimate. "Come," he said, and began guiding me toward the door. "Where?" I asked, letting myself be pulled because anywhere was better than staying alone in that dark office with the ghosts of the past surrounding us. My room, he replied simply. It's quieter. We climbed the stairs in the dark, only illuminated by the occasional lightning that turned everything into shades of white and gray before plunging back into darkness. His hand never released mine, maintaining a firm and guiding grip as we navigated the hallways I still didn't know completely. When we arrived at his room, I felt my heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of storms. It was the first time I had entered there, his most intimate sanctuary, the place where he slept and probably spent his most vulnerable hours. The door opened to reveal a space that was unmistakably masculine. Even in the partial darkness, I could see the simple and clean lines of the decoration. Dark tones of gray and black dominated, with heavy wooden furniture and severe lines. The bed was huge, dominating the center of the room, covered with dark sheets that looked soft even from a distance. There were no feminine touches or unnecessary decoration. It was functional, efficient, and completely his. Arseny released my hand only long enough to light some candles that were strategically positioned around the room. The soft and flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate atmosphere that made my mouth go dry. "Sit," he said, pointing to the bed with a gesture of his chin. I hesitated in the doorway, my body suddenly hyper-aware of where I was and what that could mean. "Arseny," I began. "If I sit there?" He looked at me over his shoulder as he finished lighting the last candle, and there was something on his face that was both tender and determined. "I'm not going to do anything. Word of honor." Another thunder exploded outside, making me flinch automatically. The decision was taken from me by my own irrational fear. I walked to the bed in quick steps and sat on the edge, wrapping my arms around my knees in a defensive posture that probably looked ridiculous but made me feel marginally safer. Arseny finished with the candles and came to sit as well, but maintained a respectful distance. He wasn't far enough to seem distant, but also not close enough to be threatening. It was the perfect balance between comfort and respect, and it made something in my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear of thunder. "Better?" he asked, and his voice was softer now, gentle in a way I had never heard from him before. "Yes," I admitted, slightly relaxing my tense posture. After a pause, I added quietly, "Thank you." Silence fell between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the sounds of rain beating against the windows, the wind howling outside, and occasionally the distant thunder that still made me shudder, but no longer seemed so terrifying with him there. The candlelight projected a soft golden glow on his face, softening the hard lines and making him seem more human, more accessible. "Can I ask you something?" I broke the silence, turning my head to look at him. "You can," he replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the dancing flames of the nearest candle. I breathed deeply, gathering courage to ask the question that had been tormenting me since the first night. "On the first night, when you left, did you sleep?" I saw when his body tensed, when his jaw locked for a second before relaxing again. He didn't look at me when he answered, keeping his eyes fixed on the flame as if it contained the answers of the universe. "No." The single word carried the weight of a complete confession. "Why?" I pressed, needing to hear his truth, needing to understand. Finally, he turned his head to look at me, and the vulnerability in his eyes left me breathless. "Because if I had stayed," he said, and there was brutal honesty in the words, "I wouldn't have left." My heart stopped, simply stopped in my chest as I processed what he had just admitted. Since the first night, since that moment when he left me alone in the bridal chamber, he had fought against the desire to stay. It wasn't indifference that had made him leave. It was the opposite. It was wanting too much. "And now?" I whispered, barely trusting my own voice. He continued looking at me, and I could see the conflict happening behind those gray eyes. "Now," he paused, and the pause seemed to stretch for an eternity. "The storm will pass, and I'll have to leave again." Something inside me broke with those words. All the barriers I had tried to maintain, all the emotional distance I had tried to preserve, crumbled at once. I could no longer pretend I didn't care. I could no longer pretend I didn't want something more than the cold and distant existence we were maintaining. "What if I asked you not to go?" I asked, and my voice was so low it barely passed a whisper. "Polina." He said my name like a warning, but there was less strength in it now. It was weakening, just like me. I turned completely on the mattress to face him head-on, folding one leg under me. What if I said that this time I choose? I saw the moment something in him gave way. Not completely. Not yet, but enough to crack the armor he maintained so carefully. His hand moved slowly, hesitantly, toward mine. His fingers hovered in the air between us for a second that seemed to last 1,000 years before finally, delicately, brushing mine. The touch was electric. It wasn't aggressive or possessive like it had been in the office. It was questioning, tentative, as if he were giving me every opportunity to pull back if I wanted. But I didn't want to pull back. Not anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Not after all the revelations and admissions. I intertwined my fingers with his, answering the unspoken question with a silent affirmation. I saw when he briefly closed his eyes, as if he were trying to gather strength or maybe say goodbye to the last vestige of control he was maintaining. "Arseny," I whispered, needing him to look at me, needing him to see the truth in my face. "Don't leave now." He opened his eyes slowly, and what I saw in them completely stole my breath. It wasn't just desire, though that was definitely there. It was something deeper, more frightening. It was need. It was vulnerability. It was everything he had fought to hide, wrapped in a silent admission that said more than words ever could. He didn't respond verbally. He didn't need to. The way his hand squeezed mine, the way his body leaned slightly toward me, the way his breathing became heavier, all of it were sufficient answers. The distance between us diminished millimeter by millimeter, neither of us wanting to move too fast and break the fragile moment we had built. The candlelight continued dancing on the walls, casting soft shadows that enveloped us in a bubble of intimacy. Outside, the storm continued, but it had become just background noise, distant and unimportant compared to what was happening between us. And then, when the space between us had been reduced to almost nothing, when I could feel his breath brushing my face and see every nuance of emotion in his eyes, something changed. It was no longer about resistance or distance, or all the reasons why this was complicated. It was just about two human beings who had fought against something inevitable, and finally, allowing themselves to give in. The night stretched before us, full of possibilities and unspoken promises. And for the first time since I had entered that mansion as a reluctant bride, I felt that maybe, just maybe, I had found something worth the entire price I had paid to be there. Chapter 7, Execution Order.
You think you can get away with this? Let go of me!
I woke up alone. The first thing I registered was the emptiness beside me, the space in the bed where he should be but wasn't anymore. I was still lying in his mattress, wrapped in sheets that carried his scent, that mix of something woody and masculine that was already becoming too familiar. I instinctively reached my hand to the empty side and found the mattress still warm. He hadn't left long ago. The impression of his body was still marked in the sheets, and I could almost feel the residual heat of his presence there beside me. Memories of the previous night came back in gentle waves, making my heart race and warmth rise to my cheeks even though I was alone. We hadn't gone far, not the way people imagine when they think of a proper wedding night, but it had been intimate in ways that mattered more than the physical. We had talked, really talked, with an honesty neither of us had allowed before. He had stayed with me through every thunder, holding me when I trembled, his solid and comforting presence driving away childhood fears. And at some point, between the whispered conversations and comfortable silences, we had fallen asleep like that, intertwined in each other in a way that felt natural and inevitable. It was the first time since the wedding that I had truly slept well, without nightmares or insomnia, just warm and safe peace in his arms. I sat up in bed slowly, pulling the sheets around my body as I looked at his room for the first time in daylight. It was exactly as it had seemed in the dimness of the candles, functional and masculine, without unnecessary adornments. But now I could see small details I had missed in the darkness. A framed photo on his nightstand, probably of his mother, a stack of books in Russian beside it, an antique watch that made a soft tick-tock. I got out of bed and quickly dressed in yesterday's clothes, trying not to think too much about how I must look, walking barefoot through the hallways toward my own room to change properly. The sun was already high in the sky, indicating it was much later than I normally woke up. Apparently, sleeping in Arseny Lenski's arms had a sedative effect that no medication could replicate. After changing and trying to do something with my messy hair, I went down to look for breakfast, even knowing it was almost lunchtime. I found Maxime in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading something on his tablet with a concentrated expression. He looked up when I entered, and something passed across his face, something that seemed almost like understanding, or maybe compassion. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound casual despite my racing heart. "Is Arseny around?" Maxime put the tablet aside and looked at me with that uncomfortable expression people have when they need to give news they'd rather not give. "Boss left early. Council meeting." I felt something in my stomach tighten. When's he coming back? He hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than any words could. Don't know. Meeting is, he paused, searching for the right word, complicated. I spent the rest of the morning and much of the afternoon in a state of growing anxiety I couldn't fully explain. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, in that primitive instinct that alerts to danger even when there's no visible evidence. I tried to read, tried to explore the mansion, tried to do anything to distract my mind, but nothing worked. When I finally heard the sound of his car arriving in the late afternoon, I ran to the entrance hall before even thinking about how desperate that would seem. The door opened, and Arseny entered, but he wasn't the same man who had held me during the storm the night before. This Arseny was different, more closed off, colder than he had ever been, as if he had rebuilt all the walls we had torn down, and added some extra layers for security. "How was the meeting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, despite the growing tightness in my chest. He didn't even really look at me, just walked straight toward the office. "Work," was all he said, the words short and without elaboration. I followed him, refusing to be dismissed so easily. "Arseny," I called, quickening my pace to catch up with him. "About last night, about what happened between us." "Nothing happened," he cut me off, stopping abruptly and turning to face me with eyes that seemed made of ice. The words hit me like a physical slap. "What do you mean nothing happened?" I asked, and I could hear the pain in my own voice, raw and exposed in a way that made me feel too vulnerable. "It was a mistake," he said, and each word was pronounced with deliberate precision, as if he had mentally rehearsed that sentence before saying it out loud. Mine won't happen again. The frustration that had been building for days, maybe weeks, finally exploded. "A mistake?" I practically screamed, not caring anymore who might hear. "You stayed with me, comforted me. It was real. Nothing that happens between us is real," he roared back, and it was the first time I'd seen him completely lose control that way. "It's all strategy, politics, business. Liar!" I shouted, taking a step toward him even though every instinct told me to back away. "Truth," he responded at the same volume, and then, lower but no less intense. "And you need to understand that now." "Why?" I demanded, feeling tears of frustration burning in my eyes. "What changed in one morning? What happened in that meeting that turned you back into this cold man?" Silence fell between us like a heavy curtain. I saw him fight with himself, when his jaw locked and his fists clenched at his sides. And then, with a controlled voice that was somehow more terrifying than the shouting, he said, "The council made a decision about your father." The world stopped. Simply stopped spinning on its axis while my brain tried to process those words and all their terrible implications. "What decision?" I whispered. But I already knew. Deep down, I already knew. "Execution," he said, and the word fell between us like a death sentence. Tomorrow night. My legs almost gave out. I had to hold on to the doorframe to keep from falling, the world spinning around me in nauseating waves. "No," I managed to say, but the word came out weak, without strength. "He broke sacred code," Arseny continued, his voice returning to that professional and distant tone I hated. "Caused death of family member. There's no forgiveness for that." "Arseny, please," I begged, and I didn't care how desperate it sounded. "He's my father. You can't let this happen. You're the Pakan. You can. And he killed my mother." He cut me off, and there was an old pain in those words that cut deeper than any knife. Tears began falling freely now, streaming down my face without me trying to stop them. "You can stop this. You have the power to do it. The council decided," he said, and there was something in the way he pronounced those words that told me there was more to the story. "It's not just my choice." "Then make your choice," I screamed, all the desperation and fear turning into anger. "For me, for us, for last night. For everything you said about forgetting when you look at me. There is no us," he said, and each word was a stab to my heart, and last night was a mistake that cost dearly. My brain tried to process that through the fog of panic and pain. "What do you mean it cost dearly?" "The council thinks I'm weakened," he admitted, and for the first time since he'd returned, I saw something beyond coldness in his face. It was frustration, maybe even regret, because of you. They want proof of loyalty. And then I understood. I understood everything with a horrible clarity that made me feel physically sick. "They want you to execute my father," I said, and it wasn't a question. He didn't deny it, didn't say anything, and that silence was answer enough. "And you're going to do it," I continued, feeling something inside me break irreparably. "You're going to kill my father to prove you're not weak." "I'll do what's necessary," he finally said, and his voice was so empty of emotion it seemed to come from a stranger. "To protect what I've built, including destroying me," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "If necessary." The two words were the final blow. I turned and ran, not caring about dignity or composure, just needing to get out of there before I completely crumbled in front of him. I heard him shout my name, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I climbed the stairs, stumbling through tears that blurred my vision, and locked myself in the bridal chamber, sliding down the door to the floor as sobs tore through me. Downstairs, I heard the sound of something hitting the wall with brutal force. Once, twice, 3 times. And then Arseni's voice, muffled by distance but still audible, shouting the F word loaded with frustration and anger, and something that sounded dangerously like desperation. But I didn't care about his frustration. I didn't care about his internal battles or moral dilemmas. I could only think of one thing. My father was going to die, and the man I had started to love would be responsible. Chapter 8. Impossible Choice.
Are you sure about this?
I have to. It's time.
Night fell over the mansion like a heavy cloak, bringing with it a darkness that seemed denser than normal, more suffocating. I spent hours locked in the bridal chamber, crying until I had no more tears, until my eyes were swollen and burning, until my throat hurt from so much sobbing. But eventually, the tears dried up, and what remained in their place was something more dangerous. Determination. I wasn't going to let my father die. No matter what Arseny said, no matter the consequences or risks, my father had his flaws, had made terrible mistakes that resulted in the death of an innocent woman, but he was still my father. He was the man who raised me alone after my mother died, who worked himself to the bone to give me a better life, who protected me even when that protection meant keeping me in ignorance. And now it was my turn to protect him. The decision came with a cold and calculated clarity that surprised me. I was going to run away. I was going to find my father wherever Arseny kept him hidden under that protection that was just disguised imprisonment, and we were going to disappear together, far from New York, far from the Bratva, far from the man I had started to love, but who clearly loved his empire more than he loved me. I grabbed a small suitcase from the closet and began packing it with hands that trembled only slightly. I didn't take much. Some practical clothes, money I had saved from the small amounts Arseny occasionally gave me, important documents I might need. Each item I put in the suitcase seemed to seal my fate, making the decision more real, more irreversible. I was folding a last blouse when I heard the door open behind me. I hadn't locked it after I stopped crying, a part of me still hoping that maybe he would come, that maybe he would apologize or tell me he had found another solution. But when I turned my head, the expression on his face wasn't one of apology. It was of cold understanding and something that seemed dangerously close to pain. "Going somewhere?" he asked, and his voice was carefully controlled as his eyes fixed on the open suitcase on the bed. I returned my attention to the clothes in my hands, refusing to look at him as I answered. "Away from you. It won't work," he said, and I heard his footsteps entering the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed much more final than it should. I threw the blouse in the suitcase with more force than necessary. "I'll try." The sound of the lock turning made my entire body tense. I turned abruptly, finally really looking at him, and saw that he had locked the door, and was now standing there between me and the only exit, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "Polina?" He said my name like a warning. "Stop." The anger that had been boiling inside me since the afternoon exploded all at once. "You're going to imprison me?" I shouted, taking a step toward him with clenched fists. "Like property? Like something you bought and can lock up when it doesn't behave the way you want?" "I'm going to protect you," he replied, and there was an intensity in his voice that caught me off guard. "From yourself." "I don't need your protection," I began, but he cut me off with a voice that was almost a roar. "You do!" he exploded, taking large steps toward me until he was too close, invading my personal space in a way that was both intimidating and strangely comforting. "You run now? The council hunts you, and kills, to send a message, to show what happens when someone defies the Bratva. Better to die free," I said, raising my chin defiantly, even though my heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Then live as a trophy." Something in his face broke. 1 second he was at a distance, the next his hands were on my shoulders, holding me with an urgency that bordered on desperation. "You are not going to die," he said, and each word was pronounced with a ferocity that left me breathless. "Neither is your father." The world stopped, simply stopped spinning while my brain tried to process what he had just said. "What?" I whispered, barely trusting my own hearing. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling rapidly as if he had run a marathon. "I'm not going to execute him," he said, and there was a determination in the words that didn't match everything he had said earlier. "But the council," I began, trying to understand the sudden change, trying to see the angle or strategy that surely must exist. "Fuck the council!" he roared, and it was the first time I'd heard him use profanity, the first time I'd seen his meticulous control shatter completely. "I'm going to break the order. I'm going to protect him, and I'm going to face the consequences." My entire body was trembling now, Not from fear, but from something much more complex. Why? I asked, searching his eyes for answers that made sense. Why do this? Why risk everything you've built? I saw when something in him gave way, when all the defenses he maintained so carefully around himself crumbled to reveal a raw vulnerability that left me breathless. Because you asked, he said, his voice coming out lower, rougher. And he paused, as if the next words were physically difficult to say. I can't deny anything you ask. Tears began falling again, but these were different from the ones I had cried earlier. They weren't from despair or fear, but from something much more complicated. Arseny, I whispered, but he wasn't finished. But understand, he continued, and his hands on my shoulders squeezed slightly. Doing this, I break code. I defy hierarchy. They'll come after me. After us. I don't care, I said immediately. Instinctively, because it was true. I didn't care about the consequences, didn't care about the risks, not when it meant saving my father and proving there was something real between us. You should care, he practically shouted, and I could see frustration and fear fighting on his face. Because now you're a target, for being my weakness. They'll use you against me. They'll hurt you to control me. Your weakness? I repeated, focusing on that specific word because it seemed to carry more weight than all the others. And then he confessed, laying everything bare in a way that destroyed and rebuilt me at the same time. My everything, he said, and there was a brutal honesty in those words that hit me like lightning. And they know, everyone knows, that I would choose you, always. Silence fell between us like snow, soft but heavy, filling all the space and making it impossible to think of anything else. He had just admitted something that changed everything, that turned our world upside down and reorganized it in a completely new way. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about strategy, it was about me, about us, about something real and frightening and inevitable. Arseny, I began, barely knowing what I was going to say, just knowing I needed to say something. Don't say it. He cut me off, one of his hands leaving my shoulder to gently cover my mouth. Not yet. He paused, breathing deeply as if he needed courage to continue. Tomorrow, after I break everything I've built, after I defy the council and become a traitor in their eyes, then you decide if you want to stay with a man who no longer has an empire. Just you. I carefully removed his hand from my mouth, intertwining our fingers as I processed what he was offering me. He was willing to lose everything. The empire he had built, the power he had accumulated, the respect he had earned through years of discipline and strength. Everything. For me. Idiot, I said, and the word came out full of emotion, loaded with something between laughter and tears. He blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Why? Because you were always just you to me, I said, raising my free hand to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble under my fingers. The empire never mattered. The power never mattered. I never wanted to marry the Pakan. I paused, gathering courage. You, just you. I saw when something in him broke and fixed itself at the same time. His eyes closed briefly, as if my words had hit some deep and vulnerable place he kept hidden. And then, slowly, he leaned in and kissed my forehead, a gesture so tender it made me tremble. Then maybe it's worth it, he whispered against my skin, his breath warm, and his touch gentle, losing everything. We stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other in the middle of the room, the suitcase forgotten on the bed, the escape plan abandoned. There was no more need to run, not when he had chosen to stay, when he had chosen to choose me above everything else. But even in the middle of that moment of connection, in the middle of the temporary peace we had found, a part of me knew this was far from over. Tomorrow would come with its own battles, its own challenges. Arseny would have to face the council, would have to break sacred code, would have to become a traitor in the eyes of the organization he had served his entire life, and I would be by his side, not as a trophy or property or punishment, but as a partner, as an equal, as the woman he had chosen above his empire. What's going to happen tomorrow? I finally asked, my voice muffled against his chest where I had rested my head. I felt when he kissed the top of my head, his arms pulling me closer. Tomorrow, he said, I do something I never thought I would. I choose love over loyalty. I choose you over everything. And after, I pressed, needing to know, needing to understand the risks we were taking. After, he paused, and I could feel the tension returning to his muscles. We'll have to fight. Against the council. Against everyone who will see me as weak or a traitor. It'll be dangerous. It could be violent. And you'll be at the center of it all. Then we fight, I said simply, because there was no other option. Not now. Not after everything we had been through to get here. He pulled me away slightly so he could look at my face. his hands holding my face with a gentleness that contrasted with the strength I knew they were capable of. "Are you sure?" he asked, and there was a vulnerability in the question that made me realize how much this meant to him. "Are you sure you want this? That you want me? Even if it means living looking over your shoulder? Even if it means always being in danger?" I placed my hands over his, keeping them against my face. "I'm sure," I said, and I had never said anything with more conviction in my life. "About you, about us, about everything." I saw when the last resistance in him crumbled. I saw when he finally allowed himself to believe this was real, that I was really choosing him the same way he was choosing me. And then he kissed me, not on the forehead or hands, but on the lips, a kiss that sealed the promise we had made to each other, a kiss that was both beginning and end. When we pulled apart, both breathing heavily, he rested his forehead against mine. "Tomorrow we change everything," he whispered. "Tomorrow," I agreed. "We start over." And even knowing the dangers that would come, even understanding we had just declared war against forces that could destroy us, I didn't feel fear. I felt peace, because finally, we were on the same side. Chapter 9. Breaking the Code.
You are mine.
The day of the execution dawned gray and cold. I woke up in Arsenie's arms, feeling the tension in his body even before I fully opened my eyes. He was already awake, staring at the ceiling with a distant expression, probably mentally going over every step of what he was about to do. "There's still time to turn back," I whispered, knowing it was a lie but needing to offer the way out anyway. He turned his head to look at me, and the determination in his eyes was absolute. "There isn't," he said simply, "and I don't want to." The following hours passed too quickly. Arsenie dressed in silence, choosing a dark suit that seemed more like armor than clothing. When he announced it was time to leave, I declared I was going with him. He tried to argue, but something in my face must have made it clear there was no possible negotiation. The warehouse was on the outskirts of the territory, an abandoned building surrounded by other industrial skeletons. Several cars were already parked when we arrived, council members waiting to witness the execution that would prove Arsenie's loyalty. "You stay in the car," Arsenie said, holding my face between his hands. "No matter what you hear, stay here with Maxime." I promised, even knowing it was a lie. I watched him enter the warehouse, the metal door closing behind him with a heavy and final sound. The minutes dragged on in slow agony, each second seeming like an eternity. And then came the sound that made my heart stop. A single gunshot echoing through the walls. I didn't think. I just ran. I opened the car door and was running before Maxime could grab me, my feet pounding on the asphalt as I ran toward the warehouse entrance. I pushed the metal door open, and the scene I found will be burned into my memory forever. The warehouse was cavernous and dark, lit by a few industrial lights. In the center, my father was tied to a chair, his face bruised but alive. Around him, several men in dark suits watched in tense silence, and on the floor, in a growing pool of blood, was Dmitry Volkov, dead. Arsenie stood over the body, gun still in his hand, his face a mask of cold authority. When his eyes met mine across the warehouse, something in them softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again. "Anyone else question my decision?" His voice echoed through the empty space, laden with unquestionable power. Absolute silence. No one moved. No one dared challenge him. Arsenie walked to my father with measured steps and stood before him. "Viktor Ivanov," he said, and his voice was different now, no longer laden with hatred. "You owe me your life, and my wife, happiness. Understood?" My father, pale and trembling, nodded quickly. "Understood." With a gesture from Arsenie, two men approached and untied my father. The ropes fell and he rubbed his wrists. Free, alive, when he should have been dead. Tears burned in my eyes, but I forced them back. Arsenie said something in Russian to the other council members. Words I didn't understand, but that by their tone seemed to be a final ultimatum. And then he was walking toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. When he got close, he held my arm gently and guided me out of the warehouse. The trip back to the mansion was silent. My father sat beside me, trembling slightly, but gloriously alive. Maxime drove with a tense expression, and Arsenie looked out the window with a locked jaw. No one spoke until we arrived home. Maxime took my father to one of the guest rooms while Arsenie and I stood in the entrance hall. The reality of what had just happened began hitting me in waves, and suddenly I could no longer hold back my emotions. I ran to him, throwing my arms around his neck and holding on as if my life depended on it. He caught me easily, his arms closing around my waist and pulling me impossibly close. "You saved him," I said against his chest, tears finally falling. "You really saved him." "I said I would," he replied, one hand stroking my hair. "Said I would choose you." I pulled away just enough to look at his face. "And now? The council? One dead. Others will decide whether to support me or betray me," he said with brutal honesty. "What if they betray you?" He held my face between his hands. "Then we run. Together. You, Me, your father, far away. You'd leave everything for us? I already have, he said, and kissed me deeply. I chose you, publicly. There's no going back. When we pulled apart, the words rose up my throat before I could stop them. Arseny, I love you. It was the first time I had said those words, the first time I offered them with so much vulnerability and truth. For a terrifying second, I thought maybe I had said it too soon, but then I saw when something in him completely unraveled. Say it again, he demanded, voice hoarse. I love you. Not out of obligation, by choice, my choice. He kissed me again, urgent and possessive. I love you too, he said against my lips. More than empire, more than code, more than life. In that moment, standing in the hall with the weight of impossible decisions still hanging over us, I knew we had crossed a point of no return. What would come would be dangerous, difficult, could destroy us, but we would face it together. Chapter 10. True Surrender.
Stay behind me.
Night fell over the mansion, bringing with it a heavy silence that seemed to vibrate with possibilities. After dinner, where my father finally managed to eat something adequate for the first time in days, everyone retreated to their own spaces, but I couldn't settle down. I couldn't simply go to the bridal suite and pretend it was a normal night after everything that had happened. Arseny had risked everything. He had broken sacred code, killed a council member, defied the hierarchy of the entire Bratva. For me, for my father, because he had chosen love over loyalty, had chosen me above everything he'd built over years of discipline and blood, and I needed him to know that choice hadn't been in vain. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing something simple, but that made me feel beautiful. It wasn't about cheap seduction or strategic games. It was about honesty, about finally allowing what we'd been denying for weeks to happen. I let my hair down, took several deep breaths to calm my racing heart, and then did what I'd wanted to do since the first night. I went to his room. I knocked on the door, 3 light knocks that seemed to echo too loudly in the silent hallway. I heard movement on the other side, footsteps approaching, and then the door opened, revealing Arseny shirtless, his hair slightly messy as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. Polina? He said my name like a question, genuine surprise in his voice. Can I come in? I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I saw when he hesitated, when the internal battle happened behind those gray eyes. Are you sure? He finally asked, and there was so much weight in that simple question. I entered without answering verbally, passing by him and hearing when the door closed behind me with a soft click. The room was lit only by moonlight coming through the window, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. I turned to face him, finding him standing near the door, watching me with an intensity that made my skin tingle. I wasn't sold, Arseny, I said, and the words came out loaded with absolute truth. No, he asked, taking a cautious step in my direction. No, I was chosen, by you. And now, I moved closer to him slowly, eliminating the distance between us. I choose you, not out of fear, not out of obligation, out of love. Something in his face broke, the last resistance finally giving way. If we do this, he said, voice hoarse, there's no going back, for either of us. I grabbed the hem of my blouse and started to pull it off, the movement deliberate and full of certainty. I don't want to go back. He grabbed my wrists before I could complete the gesture, but it wasn't to stop me. It was to make me pause and look at him, to be absolutely sure. Polina, I'm not a gentle man, in what I do, in what I am, and that includes this. I smiled, and it was the first genuine smile in days. I don't want gentle. I want real. I want you. Completely. I saw when the last line of defense crumbled. He pulled my blouse the rest of the way off, his movements now decisive, and then his hands were on my face, pulling me into a kiss that was everything the others hadn't been. It wasn't tender or questioning. It was hunger and need and weeks of denial finally exploding. I love you, he said against my mouth, the words coming out broken between kisses. Obsessively, show me, I whispered back, and that single word was all he needed. The rest of the night was lost in a haze of touches and whispers, of discoveries and surrenders. It wasn't perfect or choreographed like in the movies. It was real and intense, and sometimes awkward in ways that made us laugh softly against each other's skin. It was human and vulnerable, and absolutely ours. When we finally collapsed, exhausted among the tangled sheets, intertwined with each other in ways that seemed impossible to untangle, I felt a peace I didn't know was possible. It wasn't just physical satisfaction. It was the feeling of finally being in the right place, with the right person, at the right time. I woke to the soft morning light, filtering through the curtains. This time, Arseny was still there. He was awake, I realized, as I opened my eyes fully, watching me with an expression that was at once tender and possessive. Hi, I said, and the word came out hoarse from sleep. "Hi," he replied, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "Regrets?" "Never," I said without hesitation. "And you?" "Impossible." He paused, his hand stroking my arm absently. "Polina, about what might come. War, the Russian Council. It could get dangerous." I nestled closer to him, resting my head on his chest, where I could hear his heart beating steady and strong. "We'll face it, together. It could get very dangerous," he insisted, and I could hear the real concern in his voice. "More dangerous than living without you?" I asked, lifting my head to look at him. "Impossible." I saw when a small smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile I'd seen on him. "When did you get so dramatic?" "When I fell in love with an impossible Russian pakan," I replied, smiling back. His expression changed then, becoming more intense, more possessive. He suddenly rolled over, putting me on my back while he hovered over me, his eyes boring into mine, with an intensity that stole my breath. "My impossible Russian pakan," he corrected, his voice low and loaded with something primal. "Possessive," I observed, but there was no complaint in the words. "Completely," he admitted without shame, leaning down to kiss my neck in a way that made my breathing falter. "And you're mine, forever. Understood?" The shiver that ran down my spine had nothing to do with cold. "Understood," I whispered, and I felt when he smiled against my skin. We spent the morning like that, intertwined with each other, talking about everything and nothing, making vague plans for a future that was still uncertain, but that we would now face side by side. He told me more about his mother, about the gentle woman who had raised a boy in a world of violence and still managed to teach him about honor and love. I told him about my own mother, dead when I was too young to form proper memories, and about how my father had tried to be both parents, even while failing miserably most of the time. We were two people, broken by tragedies we hadn't even caused, trying to build something whole from the pieces, and maybe that was exactly why it worked. Because we understood each other's pain in ways no one else could. "I'll protect you," Arseny said at some point, his hand tracing lazy patterns on my back, "from everything that comes, no matter the cost." "I know," I replied, because I did. He had proven that yesterday, in a way that left no room for doubt. "And you," he continued, turning my face to look at him, "are going to let me. You won't do anything stupid or heroic. You'll trust me to keep us safe." I smiled, knowing that promise would be harder to keep. "I'll try." And we're getting to the home stretch. But first let me make a request. Leave your comment below, and maybe I'll read it in the next one. It can even be a critique. No problem. Chapter 11. The Past Returns.
I protect what is mine.
2 months had passed since that day at the warehouse. 2 months of a strange, intense peace, like the silence before a storm we knew was coming, but not when. Arseny had consolidated power in ways I didn't fully understand, making deals and breaking others, navigating the brutal politics of the Bratva with a skill that bordered on artistic. My father lived on one of Arseny's properties outside the city, safe but essentially in voluntary exile. And me, I was going through the most miserable mornings of my life. I woke that Thursday with the now familiar wave of nausea hitting me before I'd even fully opened my eyes. I managed to get out of bed and reach the bathroom in time, kneeling on the cold floor while my stomach turned violently. Arseny appeared seconds later, holding my hair back with one hand and rubbing comforting circles on my back with the other. "Again?" he asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "Again," I confirmed when I could finally breathe normally, accepting the damp towel he offered me. It was the 4th morning in a row. At first, I thought it was something I ate. Then I thought maybe it was stress. After all, it wasn't like our lives were exactly peaceful. But when the nausea continued, and my period didn't come when it should have, a suspicion began to form in my mind. While Arseny was in a meeting that afternoon, I slipped out discreetly and bought 3 different pregnancy tests at a pharmacy, far enough from the mansion not to raise suspicions. I locked myself in the bathroom and took all 3, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the first one. 2 lines, 3 times. Positive, positive, positive. I was pregnant. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the 3 tests lined up on the sink, trying to process this information. Panic and joy fought inside me in equal measure. A baby. I was going to have a baby. We were going to have a baby. In the middle of a potential war with the council, in the middle of threats and dangers that hadn't fully materialized yet, there was a life growing inside me. I needed to tell Arseny, today. I couldn't keep this. Not when it changed everything. Dinner was prepared for 7, a formal meal in the large dining room we rarely used. I was nervous, pushing the food around on my plate without really eating, mentally rehearsing how I was going to tell him. The words needed to be right. The moment needed to be perfect. "Arseny," I began, setting my fork aside and taking a deep breath. I need to tell you something. He looked up from his plate, but before he could respond, the dining room door opened and Maxime entered. The expression on his face was one of severe tension, and I immediately knew something was wrong. Can it wait? Arseny asked, looking at me with something close to guilt. Maxime brought news. From Russia. My stomach, which was already sensitive, gave a lurch that had nothing to do with pregnancy. What kind of news? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Maxim cleared his throat uncomfortably. Boss, council sent special visitor to resolve situation. Arseny tensed immediately, his jaw muscles jumping. Who? Mikhail Volkov, Maxim said, and the name fell between us like a bomb. Dmitri's brother. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mikhail Volkov, brother of the man Arseny had killed. This couldn't be anything good. Is he dangerous? I asked, looking between Maxim and Arseny. Worse, Maxim said, and there was something strange in the way he looked at me. He's smart, and he has connection to Polina's past. The world stopped. What do you mean connection to me? I asked, my voice coming out higher than I intended. Before anyone could answer, the dining room door opened again. A man entered uninvited, unannounced, as if he owned the place. He must have been about 50, perfectly styled gray hair, an expensive suit that probably cost more than a car, but it was the eyes that made me freeze, cold, calculating, and fixed directly on me, with a recognition that made me want to back away. Secrets about why Viktor Ivanov really came to America, the man said, and his Russian accent was heavier than Arseny's, loaded with years lived there. He smiled, but there was no warmth whatsoever in the expression. Hello, Polina. You've grown up beautifully. Arseny stood so fast the chair fell backward with a crash. Who the hell are you? Mikhail Volkov, the man said, making a mocking bow. The man who met Polina when she was 8 years old, in Moscow, before her father made mistakes. Memories began to surface, fragmented and confused. Moscow. I had lived there when I was little, before we came to America, but the memories were vague, distorted by time and age. I didn't remember any Mikhail. Arseny began walking around the table toward Mikhail, each step loaded with threat. Get out of my house. Of course, Mikhail said with excessive calmness. But first, Polina needs to know the truth about why her father really sold information. I know why, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Money. Mikhail laughed, and the sound made me feel physically sick. No, Dorogaya. He sold it to protect you. From me. He paused dramatically, savoring the moment. Because I wanted you. As a wife. And he refused. Absolute silence fell over the room. I felt when Arseny went completely still, that dangerous stillness that came before violence. So he sold information to get money to run away from me, Mikhail continued, as if he were telling a story about the weather. But in the end, he chose to give you to Arseny. Better choice, actually. Arseny is young, strong, has a future. I only wanted you because your father owed me. Get out! Arseny roared, the word echoing through the room. Leaving, Mikhail said cheerfully, turning toward the door. But he stopped before exiting completely, looking at me over his shoulder. I'll be back tomorrow, for negotiations, and to see you again, my bride who got away. The door closed behind him, and for several seconds no one moved. Then everything started to spin. The floor seemed to tilt under my feet. The walls began to pulse in strange ways, and a nausea much worse than morning sickness hit me all at once. Arseny, I managed to say, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I need to sit down, but my legs were no longer supporting me. I saw when he moved toward me, his eyes wide with alarm, but he wasn't fast enough. Darkness began to take over the edges of my vision, expanding like ink in water, and then everything simply went black. The last thing I heard was Arseny's voice screaming my name, loaded with a panic I'd never heard from him before, and then nothing. Chapter 12. Pregnancy and Fierce Protection.
We rule together.
I woke slowly, consciousness returning in waves. There were voices around me, urgent whispers in Russian that my foggy brain couldn't process. The first thing I registered was the soft surface beneath me, which I recognized as our mattress, the sheets with Arseny's characteristic scent. I was in his room, in our bed. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the soft light from the lamp. An older man with a black bag was putting away medical equipment, talking in a low voice with Arseny near the door. When I moved slightly, making the mattress creak, Arseny turned his head immediately, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that mixed relief and concern. He said something quick in Russian to the doctor, who nodded and left discreetly, closing the door behind him. Arseny came to the bed in quick steps, sitting on the edge, and taking my hand between his. How do you feel? He asked, and his voice was carefully controlled in a way that told me he was fighting not to show how scared he'd been. Dizzy, I admitted, trying to sit up. He helped me immediately, adjusting the pillows behind me so I could be in a more comfortable position. Did the doctor say anything? Arseny was silent for a moment, his eyes studying my face as if he were memorizing every detail. Then slowly, he took my hand and placed it against my own still flat stomach. He did, he finally replied, and there was something in his voice I couldn't fully identify. You're pregnant. Even already knowing, even having taken the tests earlier that day, hearing the words out loud made everything seem more real in a way that left me breathless. I know, I whispered. That's what I was going to tell you at dinner, before Mikhail showed up. I saw when his expression changed, going from concern to something more complex. And now? He asked. And for the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine vulnerability on his face. With Mikhail here, with threats, tears burned in my eyes. All the emotions of the day finally catching up with me at once. Fear for the baby, shock at Mikhail's revelations, physical and emotional exhaustion. It all mixed into an overwhelming wave. Arseny, what if he comes after me? What if he tries to take me? And the baby? How are we going to protect the baby when it's not even born yet? He moved then, climbing onto the bed with me and pulling me into his arms carefully, as if I were made of glass. Now I protect you even more, he said against my hair, and there was a ferocity in the words that was both comforting and frightening. Both of you. Both of us? I repeated, my voice muffled against his chest. I felt when he placed his hand over my stomach, his fingers spreading possessively over the place where a tiny life was growing. You and our child. He paused, and when he spoke again there was a note of uncertainty I rarely heard from him. Is it mine? I pulled back enough to look at him, processing the question for a second before indignation took over. I hit his chest with my palm, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to express my frustration. Of course it's yours. Idiot. To my surprise, he laughed. It was a low, genuine sound that made something in my chest tighten in a good way. Sorry, he said, but he was still smiling slightly. I had to ask. His expression became more serious then, more vulnerable. I'm going to be a father. You are, I confirmed, placing my hand over his still resting on my stomach. How do you feel? Terrified, he admitted without hesitation, and happy, happier than I deserve. We stayed like that for long minutes, just holding each other, our hands intertwined over the place where our child was growing. It was a moment of stolen peace, a temporary bubble of safety, before the storm we knew was coming reached us. And Mikhail? I finally asked, breaking the silence. Arseny's expression hardened immediately, all the tenderness replaced by something much more dangerous. He won't get near you, ever. The next day, Mikhail returned exactly as he'd promised. Arseny insisted I stay by his side in the office, refusing to leave me alone anywhere in the mansion. When Mikhail entered, that cold, calculating smile still on his face, I felt Arseny's body tense beside me. Decisions been made? Mikhail asked casually, as if he were discussing the weather and not the future of our lives. Yes, Arseny replied, his voice sharp as glass. You leave New York, today, or you die. Mikhail laughed, and the sound made me want to back away. Brave words, for a man who broke code, killed counselor, lost support. I have enough support, Arseny said, but something in the way he spoke made me feel he might not be as confident as he was pretending. Do you? Mikhail placed some photos on the desk, spreading them out with careful fingers. Your own men? In Moscow, with me, making deals. My stomach turned when I saw the photos. I recognized some of the faces, men I'd seen around the mansion, men who were supposedly loyal to Arseny, but there they were, sitting at tables with Mikhail, shaking hands, smiling. Arseny, I whispered, and the fear in my voice was impossible to hide. Half of your organization already works for me, Mikhail continued, savoring each word. Other half will decide. When they find out about baby, I felt when Arseny went completely still beside me, that dangerous stillness that came before violence. How do you know? He asked, and his voice was so low it was almost a whisper. Mikhail smiled more broadly. Doctor talks a lot. For right price. He turned to me then, and the look in his eyes made me feel dirty. Congratulations, by the way. Child will be beautiful, with proper care. Arseny stood so fast the chair fell backward. You don't touch her. Don't need to, Mikhail replied calmly, completely unfazed by the obvious threat. You give her to me, in exchange for life, your life. Never, I said, before I could stop myself, standing up too and staying beside Arseny. Mikhail looked at me with something that could have been pity or amusement. It was hard to tell. Never is a long time, Polina, especially when your husband has so many enemies. Now, get out, Arseny ordered, and every letter dripped poison. 24 hours, Mikhail said, walking toward the door with slow, deliberate steps. To decide, Polina and child, or war you cannot win. He stopped at the door, looking back one last time. Choose wisely, Lenski. It's not just your life at stake. The door closed behind him, and for several seconds neither of us moved. Then, trembling, I turned and hugged Arseny with all the strength I had. I felt when his arms closed around me, holding me so tight it almost hurt, but I didn't complain. I needed that closeness, that physical reminder that he was still here, still mine. "What do we do?" I finally asked, my voice muffled against his chest. I felt when he kissed the top of my head, one hand moving down to rest protectively over my stomach. "We fight," he said, and there was absolute determination in those words. "And we win." "How?" I asked, because honestly, I didn't see how we could win against such impossible odds. He pulled me back just enough to look at my face, and what I saw in his eyes gave me a hope I didn't know was still possible. "Together," he said simply, like always. Chapter 13, Victory and Shared Empire.
I warned you.
The final confrontation happened in the same warehouse where everything had changed months ago. Arseny had insisted I stay away, but this time I didn't give in. Not when my life and our child's were at stake. Not when we were partners. I arrived with Arseny, Maxime, and the men we'd confirmed were loyal. Mikhail was already there with his own soldiers. A dozen armed men positioned strategically. The arrogant smile was still on his face when he saw us enter. "Last chance, Arseny," Mikhail said, his voice echoing through the empty space. "Give me wife. Save Empire." Arseny took a step forward, placing me slightly behind him in an instinctive protective gesture. "My answer," he said, switching to Russian. "Itik chertu, go to hell." The shooting started instantly. Maxim pulled me behind a pile of old crates while bullets ricocheted off the metal walls. My heart beat wildly, one hand instinctively protecting my stomach where our baby was growing, completely oblivious to the danger around us. I watched through a gap when Arseny moved with lethal precision, each shot calculated, each movement economical. He was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, a predator in his element. And then I saw when Mikhail got a line of sight on Arseny, the gun raising, his finger on the trigger. "Arseny!" I screamed, my voice cutting through the chaos. He ducked at the last second. Maxime fired from where he was beside me, and Mikhail fell, simply fell, the gun slipping from his fingers, his body hitting the concrete floor with a heavy, final sound. The silence that followed was absolute. Mikhail's men looked from their leader's body to Arseny, calculating odds. One by one, guns were lowered. One by one, they knelt in submission. Later, when we were back at the mansion and the adrenaline had finally faded, Maxime brought unexpected news. "Boss," he said, entering the office where we were. "Moscow called. They want to talk." Arseny tensed immediately. "What do they want?" "Recognize you," Maxime replied, and there was something close to admiration in his voice. "As new leader for entire East Coast." I looked at Arseny, seeing shock pass briefly across his face before being replaced by something more calculated. "Promotion?" I asked, trying to understand the implications. "Bigger empire," he said, turning to look at me. "More power." And his eyes met mine with intensity. "More danger. Will you accept?" I asked, because I knew the decision wasn't just his anymore. He came to me, his hands holding my face with that gentleness he reserved only for me. "Depends. Do you want to be wife of most powerful man on East Coast? Or prefer to run? Quiet life?" I didn't hesitate for even a second. "I want to be your partner, in power, in life, in everything." "It will be dangerous," he warned, one hand moving down to rest on my stomach, which was beginning to show a subtle curve. "For you, for our child." I placed my hand over his. "Then we teach him how to protect himself, how to be strong, like both of you." Something in him softened completely. "Our child will be born into an empire that we built together." "Together," I agreed. "Always." 6 months later, sitting behind a polished mahogany desk in the new office, 7 months pregnant and still running meetings, I watched Arseny negotiate territories with lieutenants. The nameplate on the desk said it all. Arseny and Polina Lenski, co-directors. "Brooklyn territory goes to Maxime," Arseny said, pointing at the map. "Queens to Victor." My father had proven useful, his brilliant mind for numbers finally being used legitimately. "And Manhattan?" I asked, my hand resting on my stomach where our child was kicking. "Baby will need good schools there." The men laughed, already used to the pregnant Donna who commanded as much as the boss. Arseny looked at me with pride he didn't try to hide. "Manhattan stays with us. Personal oversight." Later, alone in the office, I felt when Arseny knelt beside me, his hands holding my stomach where our child was moving actively. "Remember when you bought me?" I asked, smiling. "Never bought you," he corrected, kissing my stomach. "Always was choice. Your choice. And I choose again," I said, running my fingers through his hair. "Today, tomorrow, always." A strong kick made both of us smile. "I think he agreed," Arseny said, looking up with shining eyes. "Or she," I corrected. "Doesn't matter," he said, standing up to kiss me. "Because empire needs heir. Strong heir, like the parents," I said. "Like us," he agreed, his hands possessively on my waist and stomach. "Forever. And there, in the empire we built together, sold but never owned, chosen and choosing back, I finally found my place, not as a trophy or punishment, but as a queen beside the king, as a partner, as an equal, as love. Fun facts you might not have noticed. Polina's gradual transformation happened in the physical details. She started barefoot and vulnerable in Chapter 1, ended pregnant running Mafia meetings in Chapter 13, always standing and never barefoot again. Arseny went from impersonal wife to possessive. Chapter 2 says boss's wife, but only in Chapter 10, post-real surrender, does he start saying, my wife, and you are mine. The small gestures of care, mattress, portraits, security, happened before he admitted feelings. He was already in love long before acknowledging it. Polina's fear of the storm was the only moment where Arseny broke the rules he imposed on himself. It was her vulnerability, not seduction, that made him give in. The warehouse execution mirrors Elena's death, both in ambushes executions. But Arseny breaks the cycle of revenge by choosing to forgive Victor. Polina saved Arseny by screaming at the final moment, completely inverting the role from protected to active protector that he never expected from her. The pregnancy was discovered exactly when the past returned, Mikhail, symbolizing that new life, future, can only exist after confronting and resolving the past. And if you want to check out another video full of emotion, click on the video that appears now on your screen.